thanks for everybody for coming along to this meeting on the topical issue of tackling racism in our communities. We have a number of speakers from different aspects of community activism and political activity. And we'll start off without much further ado with Joe Mooney, who is a community activist for many years in the East Wall area of Dublin. He's been active on residents' associations, political activity, arts and plays and all kinds of very cultural matters as well. But Joe will give us his rundown on tackling racism in his communities and in the city of Dublin generally as well. Thank you, Sir Joe.
Okay, I wasn't sure if I was first, so bear with me. First of all, thanks to the James Connolly Festival for the invite to speak, and obviously it is a very important topic and very topical. As was said in the introduction, I've been a community and political activist for many years, and I would have been at the forefront of the campaign in the 90s into the early 2000s during the Celtic Tiger years, defending our community against the greed of the Dublin Dockland Development Authority. I would have been involved with the bin charges campaign. I would have been involved with various resident association and community groups, and I would have been involved with the anti-drugs movement in the 1990s. And bizarrely, as some people are saying, some of the shady characters from those days are back, and I'm glad to say they're still on the other side than I am. So without further ado, okay, I know a similar discussion took place at a previous Connolly Festival on the issue of tackling racism, but I think after the events of recent months, it's vital to revisit this topic, and particularly as I'm sure we all agree that the ground has shifted considerably since the last meeting and certainly in the last 6 months. In those 6 months, we have seen an increase in the visibility of and the intervention by the far right and professional racists in our communities. But more worrying, and for me really, is that we've seen a lot of their language gain much more common currency in our communities, and even among people who would insist personally that they are not racists, certain racist tropes and attitudes have become much more commonplace. My own community in East Wall, unfortunately, has been ground zero for the upsurge in anti-immigrant protests that we've seen in the past few months. And in many quarters and in ongoing commentary, East Wall is now almost seen as synonymous with racism. This is not a fair judgment on our community, so what I can see, looking from the outside, I can see why some people might actually think that, and certainly the footage from last November of crowds outside the building chanting "get them out" while there was immigrants inside is certainly an image that won't be forgotten and shouldn't be forgotten. So I'm going to start off by describing the community and give a brief timeline of what happened last November that created the tension, and I'll also describe the efforts within the community to try and stop this situation deteriorating any further. So first of all, East Wall is normally known for its great community spirit. There's a long established local network of residents and community activists, and there's a strong tradition of volunteerism. It is a multi-ethnic and multicultural community. A large proportion of the population is non-traditional Irish, and there has been no evidence of racism or discrimination as the community demographic has changed in the last 10-20 years. The integration of this mixture of people has been entirely organic and natural. We have a community Lord Mayor. It's a symbolic thing in the community, and the current position holder is actually a Muslim immigrant. The nomination and election of this local mayor involves the participation of the entire community, and there's an election day at the community centre. The previous post holder was a 70-year-old local woman, that some people here would know, a long-time volunteer with both the youth and the senior citizens and in the anti-drugs movement. So that was the previous one. The other nominees last year were two women, one with decades of experience on the Resident Association, and a man who again had decades of experience with the football clubs, the drama group and the men's shed, etc. Yet the choice of the community was Mohammed, an immigrant Muslim who'd lived in Ireland for about 19 years, I think it is. So really our community should have been a model for welcoming refugees and should have been open to integration. So what went wrong? Before I try and answer that, I should mention early last year in March, a small number of National Party members tried to leaflet the area with a racist flyer. None of them were from the area. They received a hostile reception from householders and eventually left the area after being told numerous times they weren't wanted there. And when I say they were made unwelcome, it wasn't just by anti-racist or political activists that put them out. Residents came out of their houses and told them to fuck off, basically. That was on a Saturday afternoon. On the Tuesday evening, an anti-racist leaflet was put out in the area, distributed to 2,000 houses. People came out of their houses to say thanks for doing that. We were shocked by what we saw. On the local community Facebook page, there was discussion about the racist leaflet, and these are just some of the comments that were put up by residents. I got it in the letterbox and it went straight in the bin. Couldn't believe the leaflets that came through the door today. Foul and disgusting. Great to hear that others agree with me. Our community welcomes everyone and we are a very respected area. That was last March. Some of those people who commented in that discussion at the time were some of the people who were on the protests in November. So again, you have to say, what went wrong? The simple answer is that the government, and specifically the Department of Integration, created a situation where they dismissed concerns in the community, and this led to an explosion of anger. The complete disregard for the local community and the department's unwillingness to engage in any dialogue or share any information whatsoever alienated established community leaders, and in a vacuum, far-right agitators and racists were quick to seize their opportunity. Effectively, it was a gift handed to the far-right on a plate, and it was a gift, like make no doubt about it. They had no traction in their area, they weren't welcome, they had no way of coming in, and very quickly in November, by others' actions, the door was open for them, and they took advantage of it. In recent years, there have been protests at direct provision centres and accommodation around the country. While many of these did involve mobilisation by locals, in very many cases the controversy was whipped up by outside agitators, carefully orchestrated to look like community backlash when it wasn't, and in most cases this was exposed. But the situation in East Wall was different. This was a genuine response from residents, which the far right effectively seized upon, and it's probably fair to say that it was disappointing for me to have to say it, but it was probably the most effective mobilisation of anti-immigrant sentiment we've seen in the city. The second protest on the East Wall Road had approximately 1,000 participants, and while they weren't all local, a significant number of them were. Something that ragtag group of racist organisers could only have dreamed of weeks earlier, having that kind of numbers on the street. And then there was the knock-on effect. The protests in East Wall emboldened others to protest at the first hint of immigrants being housed anywhere near them. And in areas like Drimina and Ballymun, we saw protests entirely manufactured by racists, including a contribution by some from East Wall. The far right, their organisers, their parties and their propaganda machines suddenly felt like they were in the driving seat and worked hard to harness an initial wave of anger and tried to present this as a mass movement or a national fight back. East Wall became the poster child, not just for the Irish far right, but ironically the normally virulently anti-Irish British fascist movement were falling over themselves to identify with East Wall. While the numbers mobilised by the racist organisers in the far right were cause for concern, as any fighting would be, the street mobilisations have largely burnt themselves out for now. We can be certain that a lot of behind the scene organisation is still going on in preparation for the next electoral battle, be that local or national, and any opportunity for a return to the streets will certainly be seized upon. As anti-racists, we need to be prepared for this, but unfortunately, so much of this is now out of our control. And I'm going to return to what I said earlier. The government has created the opportunities for racist and far-right organisers to exploit their communities, and even after the events in East Wall and the knock-on effects of this, there's no indication that they've learned their lesson. What happened in East Wall could have been avoided if it wasn't for the arrogance of the Green Party-led Department of Integration and the complete dismissal of any community concerns. No information was available about the planned use of the former ESB building, and the first most people heard about it was when furniture was moved in on a Thursday afternoon. With no information available, the rumour mill started, and by that evening there was talk of anything up to 400, 500, 600 men being moved in. Once the discussion hit social media, racist tropes, scaremongering and deliberate provocation added to the tension. A lot of it from outside of our community, to be fair, but picked up by locals. While many of us tried to calm the situation down, we were at a disadvantage as we had no facts to share and were arguing in a complete abstract. Rapid contact was made by long-standing and respected community leaders with government representatives on the Thursday evening, and a very clear request was made that a statement be put out to say that nobody would be moved into the building until there had been community engagement. We stressed that this was necessary to reduce tension, and if it didn't happen, we couldn't be responsible for what would occur. Not only was there no statement made, but on Friday afternoon, coaches of men arrived and were ushered into the building. Once the footage of this was shared by locals and then quickly picked up by the far right, the situation had got out of control, and we all know what happened next. Now, as a matter of interest, the building was earmarked for 380 people. The department had a breakdown of how this should occur. The numbers of men, the numbers of women, the numbers of children, the family units, etc. that were going to go in. This wasn't made available until a week after the whole controversy started. So not even simple facts that could have helped us engage in constructive discussion were available, and this could have mitigated most of the inflammatory misinformation that was out there. So really it's no surprise that the situation became uncontrollable. And once the situation escalated, the only official response was to denounce people as racists. And this was not a good enough response, nor did it address the situation locally. People were not racist for wanting answers about their own community or raising concerns. The current number in the building, incidentally, is now 480, almost 100 above the capacity in an already unsuitable building. So it's no surprise that people don't trust the government on this. It was disappointing to see people using air quotes when they said about community concerns, and I got sick of seeing people online dismissing concerns, saying there's no concerns, it's just racism. So, as a long-time community activist, I'm very aware of how issues can take hold in a community and what people's concerns are. If I'd have been asked before anybody was moved into that building or about the plans, the first thing I would have said would be stuff like the overlooking, the open space. These are issues that come up with every new development in a community, and I would have expected people to ask them. The former ESB building is in a complex which also houses 167 apartments. The office building overlooks many of these apartments, and it looks straight into bedrooms or sitting rooms. No mitigation measures were put in place, so a line of sight directly into people's houses was a genuine issue. We would have got that with any development. The building has a shared courtyard which was very rarely used by office workers. It was considered quite safe for children to play in, but how would the presence of hundreds of new residents in the ESB building affect this, regardless of who the people coming in were? The arrival of hundreds of new residents at once into a development like this would have raised questions. People also had questions about local services and how these might be affected. The local GP is already above capacity, the local school has limited capacity left. These are valid points to raise and are exactly what would be raised and have been raised by our community in relation to any other development. There was no opportunity to raise them, and if we had, nobody would answer. In addition to these reasonably straightforward concerns, there was also the added weight of misinformation and propaganda. Much of this was based on xenophobic stereotypes, and some of the worst racist tropes were reinforced by a social media bombardment. There was literally thousands and thousands of posts, #EastWall, in the first couple of weeks of racist material. Personally, I have to admit how surprised I was to see some of the material being shared by people I know, and particularly I know who are not normally prone to racism, but it happened. A proper programme of community engagement could have helped this. Genuine concerns could have been mitigated, measures put in place to promote integration, assurances given on service provision in the area, misinformation answered, and channels of communication opened up. Even a simple education process could have helped. For example, explaining why so many asylum seekers were men, or an understanding of the status of the people coming into the building. There was absolutely no information, and people were left being bombarded by all kinds of lies. This complete lack of engagement with the community at the beginning has been worsened by the continued failure to engage since. The bulk of the effort to resolve the situation has come from within the community itself and the hard work of local volunteers and activists. Probably largely unnoticed outside the area was the reduction in tension on the street in Eastwall very quickly. This could only have been achieved within the community setting. And while it would have been preferable to end the protest straight away, the calling off of chanting at the building happened within a week, and the assembly point was moved away from the residential blocks almost straight away. Now, they might be seeing the small victories, but they could only have been achieved by community intervention, and currently there's no protest taking place. The building itself is not suitable for purpose, and the quality of service delivery left a lot to be desired. If it wasn't for local volunteers who worked with the residents in the building, organising the collection of necessities, including warm clothes, toiletries, etc., as well as establishing an integration programme, they would have been effectively abandoned to their own devices with no support. The work of these local community volunteers, often faced with serious hostility and online abuse, has been a significant difference maker to the experience of the residents of the DP Centre and did improve their quality of life. A process of community engagement by local volunteers to try and address genuine concerns and people's fears has also been ongoing since the beginning, but this has been largely kept out of the spotlight. We could have chosen to stage counter demos, we could have had gone for publicity opportunities, but we realised that the long-term engagement directly with members of the community who would support the protest and separating them from racist overtones and from the racist organisers was ultimately the best long-term solution. In January, a leaflet featuring a photograph of well-known community activists calling for the protest to end and inviting residents, regardless of their stance, to engage with us was distributed across the area. This led to community engagement on the issues. This led to an engagement on the issues within the community. And despite attempts to undermine this by those who wanted to capitalise politically, it proceeded. Many of those who engaged, while sharing concerns based on racist tropes, expressed that they were not racist. Many wanted to clearly distance themselves from the far-right influence. Numbers substantially dropped after the initial protest, and on one occasion when the Irish Freedom Party were given a platform, residents visibly walked away. That can be seen on the footage, and people told us afterwards they didn't want to be there. One man said to us, "It was all right until that lot came along." During discussions with people, one young mother said to us, "I just want to make my area safe. I'm not trying to make Ireland great again." So in people's minds and talking to us, even though they might have been using racist language, working off racist stereotypes, they were clearly saying, "I'm not a racist," and they were clearly disassociating themselves from the far-right organisers. As a member of the East Wall community and as an anti-racist, the past 6 months have not been pleasant. We have seen how quickly tension can rise, and we have seen how easily this can be hijacked. We are definitely in a new period where far-right players and their racist ideas have made some kind of breakthrough, and they will certainly seek to build on that. We have to be prepared to counter this, but slogans and rhetoric are not going to be enough, and we have to be thoughtful and tactful. We must also be aware that this is a three-sided fight. Yes, we must challenge the racists, but we must also challenge the government and their policies that have created the opportunities for the racists to enter our communities. We must demand that they respect working class communities and they must engage to address the issues surrounding the housing of refugees and asylum seekers. Failure to engage is only creating tension that serves neither the best interests of refugees or the existing communities. Just in conclusion, I want to say some of the necessary discussions that have to be had are going to be difficult, but that's all the more reason to have them. What's the point of having these discussions if you blank the hard ones? They're the ones you need to have. It's not good enough to promote a slogan saying, "Refugees welcome here," if you are part of the problem that creates the very environment that makes them unwelcome. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Joe. I should have explained at the start that the format of the meeting will be each of the speakers will speak for about 7 to 10 minutes or less if they wish, but that's about the maximum. And then after we've had the 4 speakers, we'll take questions and answers and a bit of a debate or discussion or contributions from the audience. So the next speaker we have on the list is Helena McCann, who again is a long-term activist in her community. She's based in Kildare, but she's also active in political events in Dublin, and she can give a bit of an insight, I think, into what's been happening in Kildare and specifically in Athy and other related matters, again on the issue of tackling racism in her community.
Thanks. So as Mike said, I'm from Athy. I've lived all my life, or most of my life in Athy. I work in Athy, and kind of echoing what Joe said earlier, the last 20-25 years, organically, the landscape of Athy has changed. We've a lot of dubs, they've swarmed the place, and then we've residents from all over the world living in Athy, and there was always issues, but there was not what we're seeing now. I'm not going to go back over kind of that, but it's been it's peaceful. We've communities from Nigeria, from all across Europe. We have community from the Congo, everywhere, anywhere you can think of. We have people from that area in Athy. They go to school with our kids, and it was lovely up until recently. So I'm just that's where I'm coming from with this. So firstly, thanks to the James Connolly Festival for inviting me here to speak tonight, and thanks for Mags for chairing such an important and relevant discussion. these notes are to keep me on track because I tend to ramble, so bear with me. So I was asked to speak on tackling racism in our community, and on the face of it, for a lot of us here, some of you that I know, the answer would be fairly obvious. It's a simple one, and I know a younger me would have said the answer is probably a solid pair of boots. That's as simple as that. But in recent years, perhaps my age or the fact that we have such a diversification of my community, I've come to realise it's a lot more complicated than that answer. To combat racism, we first need to recognise that not all racism is equal. And bear with me, I know that can sound really, really weird for a lot of us in here. But if we ignore this and we can't competently tackle what we're not understanding, we also need to acknowledge that the root cause of racism is different for different people. Not all racism is based on supremacy, and it cannot all be addressed in that fashion. A country's history and political scene plays a major part in how racism is constructed and enacted, and this means that racism will have a different face and also needs a different opposition tactic in each country. That is why we were all here tonight, looking around. I know that not many in this room would shy away from physical confrontation if there was a threat to a person of minority. And I know most of you would drop everything for a counter-protest, the hateful demonstrations recently, the anti-immigrant groups and the counter-protests that have happened shows that you will put your physical safety in front at a drop of a hat. But and I'm unapologetically in favour of that when it's needed. But that's the easy battle sometimes. Where it gets difficult to know what to do is when we are dealing with our friends, our co-workers, family and neighbours on what has become known as microaggressions. We've all heard, paint yourself black and you get everything. Clutching at bags when certain minority groups are around, or the foreigners taking our jobs, the foreigners taking our dole. We've heard them all, and I could go on for 10 minutes on all the different lists. But we've all heard them. So while these acts don't pose an immediate physical danger to the people they are aimed at, some might say that they are more prolonged and painful threats. So what do? We can't punch Mary from 3 doors up because she said an Arabic-looking man could be a member of ISIS because she read it in Take a Break, or we can't headbutt Frank in work because he made a joke he heard on a Netflix special. But we can't ignore them either. We need to educate ourselves on the issues that these people might have. We need to educate ourselves on housing issues, social welfare issues, cultural differences, immigration protocols. We need to have an answer for these people. But we need to tackle every instance where we see this happening, whether it's in work or in our schools. Great thing in my house is, anyone that knows, I have a load of teenagers, and they'll be telling me about something someone done or said in school, and I'll always ask them, well, what did you do to stop it? What did you do? And that's where we need to start. If every one of us, we can empathise with people without necessarily being on their side. We can understand why people are upset, but we can redirect their anger, and that's what we need. But we can never accept it or allow this behaviour to go unchecked. In all honesty, here tonight, who has ignored a family member sharing This Is Ireland, the one with the Ivory Coast post on Facebook, where we just say, they don't know any better, or I can't be bothered to talk to them about what they're doing. But we can't ignore the small instances in our daily life. Because the people that are suffering at this insidious and constant racism, they can't take a day off to ignore it, or they can't ignore it because your ma's best friend doesn't really understand, or she's old, so leave her on. We have to try and explain to these people that it's not on, and it's not acceptable. When racism is coming from a place of fear, jealousy, wrongly directed anger or ignorance, we have to talk it out too. We can't talk it out anymore. We have to explain it to people why it's wrong. We have to educate them. When we're tired of doing that, we polish off our soapboxes and get back on them and keep fighting, keep arguing with people, keep discussing with people, but we have to keep doing it. It's our duty to put ourselves between the perpetrators and the victims of racism. Unfortunately, more often than not, that just means arguing points and facts with the owl one in the shop, or it's confronting fashion on Cathedral Street. That's saved for special occasions. So finally, when I was asked to speak here tonight, I didn't have a clue what I was going to talk about. I hate talking in public. So I asked a really good friend of mine, we were talking about it, and I said, like, what did she feel? My friend, she's from Nigeria, and she lives in my town for 20 years, and everyone loves her, everyone knows her. And what instances felt the worst for her? And I asked her, what should I do in these instances? And her answers were, the 1,000 small acts cut her deeper than the 10 big ones. And this is from a lady who's been spit on in the streets. And she says it's the ones where she's taken her house 10 times a day, cuts her more. And when I asked what should I do, she said, speak up. That's it. That's all.
Thanks very much, Helena. The next speaker is Juliana Sassi from CATU, which is Community Action Tenants Union. She's also a political activist. Community CATU, people may know, works in the area of tenants' rights, preventing evictions and so forth. So I'll hand you over now to Juliana.
Thank you. Yes, so I wrote some things, but I'll also improvise a little bit coming with what the other speakers were saying, because I think we need to acknowledge, if we say that racism is structural and institutional, we need to acknowledge that people from working class communities are always going to express racist views, because if we understand that our society is shaped through concepts of race, concepts of national identity, citizenship, these kind of things are going to be there, and then it's no surprise that the right wing is going to find a fertile soil to go ideas of look after your own first. And if you think like the targets of racism in Ireland change, we always have racism towards traveler people. This is not anything new. We have a lot of racism against Nigerian people coming here. We did a referendum from the citizenship changing from, just soils from blood. So you had all these kind of things coming, but of course I agree that things became more intense lately, because I can feel this when I go to work on the doors. I am from the Ballymun Finlas branch, so it's also a little bit like what Joe was saying in East Wall. We had like this protest that make a shift in the narrative. So if before we could have some kind of covert racism, or some just genuine concerns of the community, because I totally agree that it's a genuine concern. Someone asked how we're going to get more people in if we're not able to provide a housing, if a person from my family is homeless, and this kind of thing. This is all kind of conversation that you need to have. They are concerns, and we need to have the information to address. Talk about vacancy, talking about changing the target to the government, not someone that it's been as abused, as exploited, as vulnerable as you are, as a working class person. So I think when you think about tackling communities, racism in our communities, we also need to reflect what community means, because as being a migrant myself, am I a member of the Ballymun and Finlas community? Not traditionally. So coming from like a communist, a Marxist perspective, we need to give different meanings to community. We have a community in the local level, the neighborhood level, but in the last instance we are talking about working class community and the human community. That it goes through international solidarity and so on. So once we talk about like my community and so on, you need to understand this community is mobile. It's going to include different people than the so-called your own. It's going to have like a migrant organizing there, like myself, and then. We just need to be aware of this, because the way we define community, who is included or not in a community, who is included or not in a working class definition, is going to shape the way you are going to address the problem. So we need to understand, like really in the intellectual level, but in the practical level, that migrants are working class people, can be or cannot be, not necessarily, but if they are living in Valinor and Finglas, they pretty much are. So we need to understand that they are part of this community as well. And I had a very good experience organizing there. I'm with CATU from the beginning building this. But then, since the protest started there, the discussions and engagement became like very difficult. And we can see that Irish people has a big role to address racism, to tackle racism in the communities. By calling people out, or by being on the streets, engaging in conversation in this neighborhood level, or with your mates in the workplace or whatever. What you could think that at the same time you take out the agency of migrants, that again we need like the help of white people to address this, but I don't think so much that way. I think it's like we need to work together towards this, because it's an issue that affects us all. If we think that we need to redirect who our enemy are, and all this kind of definition of like working class community building is important, because we are in this fight together. So we need to redirect to the ruling class, like the government and those that are profit and vulture funds and all. And it is pretty much something that the community are aware of. So when you talk about vulture funds and they get like they are like messing up with the community and all. So people engage in this kind of conversation, the conversation shifts, so this is very important. But we also need to be aware, if we want to grow the involvement of migrants in our groups, how we are going to be really solidary, because sometimes we put more like racialized people in positions that are very difficult to take. So if you think about, I don't have a problem if you go into physical concentration, physical confrontation, many groups do have, because they might be deported, or because they are like, just the way they look, they are a target by being on the street. So people has different levels of risk that they take just by being themselves, and we need to be aware of these things when we are thinking about building communities. Let me see if there is another thing that I think it's relevant. So like so we felt like this shift. We have been another thing that like start to happen is that like people start saying pretty like racist thing overtly, like openly to me or other migrants groups. But when you see that people from CATU, the people who knows our work and it's the area, they go to talk to them, like the narrative shifts a little bit. So it's something that has been very important, and yeah, I think that's basically what I have to say.
Thanks very much, Juliana. And last but not least, we have a contribution from Eileen Flynn, Senator Eileen Flynn, who's an independent senator who spoke already this year at the Dublin Communities Against Racism event at Leinster House, which was the launch event, and was very positive and a very good speech. So hopefully she'll give us a reprise now.
I feel like a parish for the last, for the last 12, 13 years, looking for meaningful, good hate crime legislation for people from minority groups and people of colour and disabled people, etc. So I've been an activist for over 13 years, and of the heart of what I do is human rights and equality for members of my community, the traveller community. but I don't believe I can want equality for just our community. If you really mean equality, you mean live and let live. And that's where the difference is. I was born and reared in Ballyfermot, and I'm a working class girl as well as being a member of the traveller community. So that intersectionality we have to look at as well. And just to touch on the far right, because I don't like wasting our valuable time in talking about them progressing when we need to progress as people who are trying to tackle racism and discrimination, where we need to be organised. To say that many people and those protests wasn't far right, didn't have the ideology of far right. They didn't. If we look back at World War II, we know what far right is people that believe that you can only be born into one race, that you should have the blonde hair, the blue eyes, and there's only one race, and that's the white race, and settled people, if you want. And if we look back at what happened to Roma people in World War II, that's always going to be the case in the world. Unfortunately, we're always there's always going to be other in the world. But how do we make people's lives a little easier? You know, like I'm 33 years of age, and this is my first time in this country, sadly, to see the big mass, well, the thousand, it's a Latin in our country, protesters that's keeping the foreigners out, look after your own. But my question, and I've asked this question more than once, and maybe people who's been at other talks, who's Ireland's own? Because it's most definitely not the poor drug addict down Grafton Street or the poor homeless person. Most definitely not. It's not the traveller community. It's not the poor people within Irish society either. So Ireland has to ask herself the question: who is your own? When you go into our local hospitals to get treatment, who's the person that's looking after you? You're not going to say, no, you can't look after me because you're from India. If you need help, you're going to accept the help. And again, I think as a country, you know, I think we are being funded. Obviously, that's evidence. We've been funded. The far right has been funded by America, and of all people, the English. You know, to come here, look after your own. And I was really frustrated in the night when I seen a woman from England going on to Warmore Street, where we were all born and reared and going up and down for years. Many people, no matter what county you're from in Ireland, you know, in the Christmas you come up around and you know the atmosphere of Moore Street, to film our multicultural communities that we have, that we should be embracing, instead to put it on social media to show hatred. Look at Dublin, it's meant to be, what was it? It's not even what I'm even thinking about, but anyway, it was so racist. And I comment underneath it to say to her, like, if you don't like it, you know where to go, you know. And again, I don't believe you fight fire with fire. We have to educate each other that, like, racism is racism, discrimination is discrimination. And I can tell you right now, it can knock you it can knock the life out of you, where you feel rejected, where you feel you're less in society, where you're not an equal member of society, and you're always just going to be the black person, the traveller person. You're a piece of dirt really in society, because the white Irish settled person, middle class person has the upper hand, so you're always feeling less. That has a dramatic impact on people from minority groups in this country. It has a dramatic impact on people's mental health. The traveller community, traveller men are 7 times more likely to die by suicide than men in the general population. Traveller women 6 times more likely to die by suicide than women in the general population. And I know of some travellers, and including my own family, where, see, fear. We look at Donald Trump, what he did when he was getting elected was he was going to make America great again and take out all the foreigners and give American people back their rights and everything that made them American, right? Here in this country, the government is not standing up, bound and saying that. But that's exactly what they're doing, and they're playing into that politics, you know. But they're leaving the people do it. They're leaving the people on the street do it. Where you say you have the single mother who is absolutely desperate in her house, probably with 2 or 3 children, by herself, now having the way of feeding herself, taking the food out of her own mouth to give it to her children, who are saying, actually, if I go out to these protesters, am I going to get rid of these people? Am I going to get more? And, you know, so unfortunately, with the cost of living, with everything going up, people are genuinely struggling. And not everybody that went out in those marches are members of the far right and don't even understand far right politics. Because when I say to my sister, only last week I went to McDonald's with her, thinking I was nice and bringing her over for a burger or whatever, and she's like, oh, all the foreigners, Eileen, you know, there's an awful lot of foreigners. And I'm looking at her saying to her, do you know, like, you can't speak like that. And I'm saying to her, in another 5 or 10 years, when people are integrated into society, when people are working in our hospitals, working in our education system, you're still going to be the knacker. You're still just going to be the trapper. You're still, that's who you're going to be. So why won't you work with people and work with the people who are seeking safety within our country? People who like, I spoke with migrant nurses today from India, and we had a briefing in TV, and basically those 4 nurses would give anything to be back in their own country now, you know, and to have a good income, etc. They're working in the hospitals and shit wages, can't bring their family home with them, you know, and you're trying to educate people, but that's draining. In 2023, to be sat up here as, like, you know, starting out in someone who was 18, 19, sitting up here as a 33-year-old woman with 2 children and thinking, is life ever going to get better for them? And I believe, like, we have to have hope. We have to believe that, you know, that we can tackle racism in our country. But laws and legislation is not about locking people up and throwing away the key and saying you committed a hate crime. It's about educating people. It's around doing it in a respectful manner, because the last thing people need is for you to go out and say you're racist, you're out in these protesters, without understanding where people are coming from, you know. And I would say our language is very, very important, because, and I've heard it as well even this evening, the us and the them, the othering. What we should be doing is saying us, you know. People that live in our communities, even in the likes of Ballyfarmer, I'll use for an example, we did an event of bringing around 128 flags from different countries, and I remember giving a speech at it and saying, you know, people have the right to thrive, not just the right to exist in a community and to be experienced racism and discrimination. People have the rights to take part, to participate, and also to thrive, to belong in communities as well. So I will say that, firstly, we are all different, and we all have the right to be different. We're no 2 individuals are born the same. I have a twin sister, we're 2 completely different people, but we are of equal value to the world, you know, and that's what Ireland, we need to be delivering that message to our local communities, that we are of equal worth and we should be treated with equality of opportunities as well. And to say about the government, unfortunately, not giving information, not speaking to the local communities, is breaking down the trust with the government. And at the end of the day, the government can put good, like the homeless crisis, we have over 30,000 vacant houses that we could give to people, even though there's hundreds of thousands vacant houses that's underneath courts and they're going underneath some kind of legal stuff at the moment. In some of the houses you can't give them out, but there is at least 30,000 that can be refurbished and can be given out and can create homes. You know, the answers are there, the solutions are there for the government. It's really about implementation, and for the government to stop dividing to conquer, because now more than ever, like, there's war going around and all around us, and now more than ever as community, I think we need to stick together, but most importantly, as working class people, as people from minority groups, we need to stand up and own our communities again. And this whole thing about our Ireland's own, you know, who lives here belongs here, and we should be able to feel safe within this country. So, you know, I don't want to be blabbing now. For me, it's really about looking after people and living and let live. I think that's the most important thing. And ordinary people in the likes of Ballyfermot, Crumlin, Dundalk, Coolock, East Wall are the most lovely, genuine people you'll ever meet in your life, But yet, what's happening is we have gobshites that's jumping on campaigns like the homeless crisis campaigns that we've all been a part of in our own local communities. They're jumping on the vulnerability of people in working class communities, and as Joe rightly said, they're not as big as what they were in November, so hopefully we won't see them out in the streets anytime soon. So yeah.
Thanks very much, Eileen, and again thanks to the other three speakers. Right, what we'll do now is allow people to make contributions from the floor. I'd ask people to keep the contributions fairly short and maybe like as a question or whatever, rather than a 10-minute diatribe from your own political group, which tends to happen, I'm afraid. But before we do that, Aaron has given me instructions. If somebody up there is a bucket, just to pass around for contributions, and it's not me saying it, it's Aaron saying it. Something about silent money, he said.
Silent money is preferable. Make them grab what you will.
They're just greedy, that's all it is. If people indicate by sticking their hand well up in the air to speak, because it's very dark here and I'm looking into the light, can't really see. So if anybody has a contribution or anything to make, this side here.
Right, thanks very much to all speakers. Just a couple of speakers touched on the idea of redirecting anger, and I suppose there's always going to be righteous anger in communities where there's inequality and injustice. So just give the panel maybe space to elaborate on the concept of channeling anger back in the right direction. I mean, obviously we have to wait a while in between elections and that, and so do we have to wait to be reactive again until the thing crops up, or is it true sort of vehicles like tenants unions, and we were talking about trade unions last night being redundant, but you just kind of some thoughts on redirecting that righteous anger and maybe some tactics around that?
Anybody want to contribute, Joe?
I think I hit on the redirecting the anger a little bit, and it's difficult, especially outside of Dublin. Dublin has, there's lots of groups and that. Outside of Dublin, it's really easy to say, don't be angry at this person, be angry at the TD or the senator or the councillor who lives beside us, who we know their dads, their granddads. They're good people, we know them, we play football with their family, and it's really hard to say you have to be angry at this guy that you've known your entire life because he's not doing his job, but you can't be angry at this person you don't know, so it's hard. And then even to redirect them during elections is hard. Like if their mas and dads voted for whatever, fill in the blank, they're going to vote, and it's hard. But a good way to kind of, instead of redirecting their anger, get them involved in things outside of what we have or what we haven't got, community groups, and bring people together so that you dissipate the anger. That's one tactic, So if you have, community groups, mom and toddler groups where you're in the community and you're getting people. A lot of the time the anger dissipates when they start recognising people within our community as part of our community rather than outsiders coming in.
And I do think a way of doing that is really to say, people who are seeking refuge, people who are seen to be different or from minority groups are not the problem, are not the issue. The issue is, unfortunately, our government, that won't. So I think that messaging of saying, the people, ordinary people, are not the problem, it's the government that's the problem. And especially around elections, obviously people are going to vote their own way, but again, it's the who's failed in the homeless crisis, who failed the people, the government, who failed the people in our health crisis and in our hospitals. It wasn't other people, it was the government. You know what I mean? So it's really about delivering that message of, it's not people failing people, it's government, it's our state that's failing the ordinary person and the ground. And those people, in my opinion, maybe I'm very biased, vote for change. you know, and that's how I be.
Yeah, and I think we should be more propositive in a sense that sometimes you're just responsive and
Yes.
you stay trapped in their own narrative, like, you know, bringing out, like, our narrative is just like a response inside their own logic, and we should be more propositive, like CATU saying, okay, we want public housing. So like we are going to fight for public housing, we're going to organize social housing, public housing tenants in Ballymun, you're going to do this direction. And this is a thing that people in Ballymun as well said, because many people went to the first far right protest there, but then like they reported to us, like when we got to the meeting, they said, wow, we are terrified, it was like pretty ugly, it was like a real shit show, so people didn't come back, and they lost a bit of strength as well, like Joe was saying as well. So, and then like people come to the meeting because we're actually having an actual campaign of like fixing people's home, so like pressure the DCC to fix things, and also then when you ask for more public houses in the area, they are like they are good quality, they are not just going to be something that is going to fit through this because social houses are like marginalized, are stigmatized, so if you want more public house, you want like dignity for people who is already living in public house and don't have any service and all. So we are giving like concrete things while they're just, you know, saying, agitating and not presenting anything.
And I think that reassuring people that if someone who's on social welfare, like if you're giving to somebody else, you're not taken from them. Because I think a lot of the time, like I know within my own community, people are so desperate and poor and getting little or no services. You have to reassure that if you give, if people are getting services, and even look at direct provision, people are on like €19 a week, and ordinary citizens don't have that information, where it shouldn't matter anyway, it wouldn't matter to me or you, but to maybe very vulnerable, like people who are really, really struggling, and unfortunately, think if you give to others, you're taken from me, and I think we have to break down that narrative too. Yeah.
Well, that's the famous story about the cake and the cookies and so on. Just because like you're getting a small bit doesn't mean your bit is getting smaller because somebody else is getting something. And the easiest political thing at the moment to hang that on, I think, is the fact it's been in the papers, kind of hidden away on the 15th or 16th page. 65 billion, the government has a surplus of 65 billion from taxes this year, and they had a meeting today and they're sitting around wondering what they're going to do with this money, you know. Like we need to pin their point now where it should be spent, rather than various ministers with vested interests saying that they should give even more subsidies to developers to build more substandard apartments and whatever, you know, as part of their argument about achieving their housing goals or whatever, which we know that really no intention of doing. But like 65 billion is a massive amount of money, and it's going to be even more next year. So kind of to answer your point, I think it's just a hook to hang something on, and then you can talk about housing and other issues, you know, when you're aware that it's not a shortage of money, you know, that's just a way of dismissing people's concerns, you know.
They didn't use the whole budget last year.
Yeah, exactly, and they didn't use huge numbers of the money for travellers. Housing wasn't used either by many of the councils.
Oh,
sorry, Joe.
No, I was going to say, I don't have the exact answer. If I did, I would have won years ago and retired by now. But in many ways, it's a simple thing to say. I mean, we have to kind of go back to basics with our communities. We have to politicise our communities because they're not political anymore. I go back to the 1980s when I was a teenager. The anti-drugs movement changed the landscape in Dublin and the country. In the 1990s, the second wave of the anti-drugs movement, which emerged in working class communities, was despised. Everything the state had was thrown at it, changed the landscape again. All the drug services we have now, a lot of the youth services, a lot of the community services that are funded, came on the back of the mobilisation of working class communities. People always focus on what they call the vigilantism element of it, which I don't have a problem with. But people say, oh, that was the vigilantes, but it wasn't, there was a lot more to it. And that changed our cities. It looked at cities that had been, communities that had been neglected, run down, deliberately ignored, and stood up and said, this isn't good enough. It took on the state. It didn't just take on the drug dealers, it took on the state and changed the country. Some of the campaigns, like the bin charges campaigns, were really strong, etc. They mobilised communities generally. But you don't see that, and of course, going back again, sorry, the Republican movement from the 1980s mobilised communities massively across the country, and particularly Dublin. But you don't see that level of community politicisation anymore. People fight for issues, but it's almost they rely on clientelism now. And I've fallen into that trap myself. You want something done, so you end up pushing the next, way, the next political point, and you win something and you pocket it, but you don't build something behind it. So I think it's going back to basics and politicising our communities is what's needed to tackle all these things. But again, from my own point of view in a community, like for me, it's kind of head scratching to see my community fighting over 400 immigrants on fold-up beds in a shitty office, when in the 1990s the docklands in Dublin was the most valuable land in the country. It was valuable land owned by the state, and it was all basically given away to private property developers by the DDDA and what's the bank called that collapsed? Anglo. That was all originated in our area. The most valuable land in the country, the largest tracts of land that could have been built as social housing or could have been used for other things to generate money to build social housing, was given away to people like Johnny Rowan, who's still making money. At the minute, there's 2,000 apartments that have planning permission in East Wall. When they got planning permission under the fast tracking system, all built to rent. They still haven't been built because they've been wrangling around the money, whichever flush of funds going to get to build them. So there's 2,000 of them sitting there, but people are still more interested in 400 immigrants getting to sleep on shitty beds, rather than why this land is sitting there, why there's going to be 2,000 apartments in our community that we're never going to get to have. So I think, and I would see myself somewhat responsible as having, I don't mean personally responsible for all the problems of Ireland, but in the community, we worked hard, we built a politicised community, and we probably took our foot off the pedal, and we haven't really been replaced by a new wave of activists. But I think that's what's really needed, is to look back at our communities, look at the structures within our communities, and start making political again, rather than just reactive, and it involves everybody. The people in East Wall who were protesting at the building initially, not have stuck with it, were people who were some of them were at the forefront of the anti-drugs movement, some of them were involved in the residents' associations down through the years. They're straying off the path, but I know in their hearts, one of them said to me, "But Joe, I'm a socialist," when I was arguing about this. So I think people understand how society works, they understand where the problems are, but there's not many mechanisms for them to advance now, and because of that, it's easy for them to go down the wrong path. And just talking about, you were saying about the far right. People have rejected the far right in our community largely. Some of them have definitely gone with the Irish Freedom Party, and they will re-emerge coming up with the elections, either as independents with the backing of the Irish Freedom Party or under the Irish Freedom Party name. It's a very, very small minority. But people should be aware of how politicised the anti-immigration protests were. A lot of people on it weren't racist, but they were taking part in protests. But there was people definitely pulling the strings who were political. You just have to look at the fact, what politicians and what activists have they targeted? They've targeted progressive independents, they've targeted Sinn Féin, they've targeted socialists. They haven't gone for any of the government members. They've marched in communities on foreigners. They've marched in some communities on active members of their own community because they don't like that they were challenging them. But they've targeted the opposition. They haven't targeted government parties. They're targeting the opposition because they see them as seats that they want to take. So people shouldn't be under any illusion, even though the far right might be minuscule, they might be irrelevant, they are setting out their stall. And in my area, if you look at, on the first march or the second march, the first politician they started targeting was Mary Lou. Now, I'm not a sinner. They started targeting Mary Lou. If you go on to Twitter and you hashtag East Wall and search it, you'll regularly see Mary Lou being attacked and saying, "Why didn't you do anything for your people in East Wall? You ignored the people in East Wall." The fact is, she is the only politician who tried to meet residents, to engage with them, and tried to bring them to meetings with the ministers. She's actually the only politician that has done the most for them, but she's the one that is still being targeted the most, and that's purely politically motivated. So anyway, sorry.
Sorry, Joe, can I just ask you there, with your dealings with government, I don't know if you had personal dealings, but has there anything been done since they moved in terms of advising the community or any information from the state other than what Dublin Communities Against Racism has produced that leaflet, which is a great leaflet, because in Clondalkin now we had the same problem in Dalkin House. There was about 250 refugees there, and the far right again started targeting. We all went up, even residents and people before profit, some people from Sinn Féin, and we all protested. And the language from some of these, and I'm sorry to say, but mainly women, the hostility. They actually started targeting me in the road 2 weeks after when I was walking home. They said, "Are you one of those paedophiles?" They start calling you paedophiles and what name and all this kind of stuff. What? So they closed that place, but now they're going to open it again because they have this fire safety thing sorted out. So the refugees will be coming back in there. And I was at a history meeting last night. There were 6 of us, and there was everyone's over 50, and the other 5 women that were there. Each and every one of them said to me, even though I was trying to defend, say, no, you feel unsafe. There's 100 white people moving in there. Well, this kind of stuff. They him and haw, and the dearth of information. Mm-hmm. This is the second time we're in Dublin. Even though we have direct vision, and it's not really working, do you know what I mean, for the people that are living there. The second time around, there's still no information coming to any resident in the area. Last week we got a letter from one of these racist organisations. Every house, 338 houses, same amount of nonsense about their ex-army, their ex-this, and the WhatsApp group was going everywhere, and I said, listen, hold on a second, this is ridiculous stuff. And I sent the Dublin communities, and things started to die down again. But, I'm just trying to see, did the government do anything after the whole thing was over, or was it just walk away?
No, they haven't done anything, and they absolutely haven't learned. We offered on the Thursday before our open the work, we spoke to government parties. A number of us offered ourselves as people who would help mediate a process within the community. But one thing we made clear is we're not guilties for the government. It's not my job to go out and sell the government's position when I don't support it. But we did say we need to calm this down. There's people here who will work with the community. And I've no doubt if they had gone through a process of meeting the community, explaining what was going on, listening to the genuine concerns people were going to have, answer the misinformation, things would have turned out a lot different. There still would have been difficulties, there still would have been arguments, but it would have turned out a lot different. You'd think after looking at what happened in East Wall, we predicted it. I said to, I won't say who he was, a government politician on Thursday, said if you don't do that, we won't be answerable for what's going to happen. And I messaged him on Friday afternoon and I said I hope they're going to take responsibility for what happens. You'd think after what happened in East Wall, considering that it sparked off a wave of protests around the city and around the country, they'd step back and say, okay, maybe there's another way of doing it. But there's absolutely no evidence. The most work that I see in East Wall to help the situation in the building with the people who are in there are done purely by locals who are volunteering to help the people. My own daughter was one of the people who went in because she's a midwife to work with some of the pregnant women in there. They had a woman who was 8 months pregnant and hadn't even been to a hospital who was in that building, and nobody told her what to do. We had complaints saying why is there ambulances at the building all the time? Residents were saying there must be something terrible on there, why are there ambulances all the time? So we found out there are ambulances there all the time because the people in there don't have the money to get taxis to go to hospitals or to the doctors. Nobody tells them how to do it, so they simply ring an ambulance and get you to the hospital. Just stupid things like that. There's no structures put in place for the people. Sorry, I went off on a bit of a tangent there. So the most help I've seen for the people in the building have come from local volunteers who want to help it. The government have done nothing to help that. In the last couple of weeks, they've changed the management of the building. The guy who was the manager of the building when it opened was an event manager. That's what he professionally was. He wasn't a social worker, he wasn't any kind of coordinator, he was an event manager. He's now gone, so they put another person in there. So, with any job, especially in a building where you have 400 some people, switching over coordinators in the middle of something, how chaotic it is. So no, they haven't learned anything.
I think it's important just to note that, again, this suits the government, okay? If you're putting in 400 people into a very disadvantaged area that already has, say, an overcrowded GP or a clinic, say, for people's health or the schools, okay? When they're putting in 400 people, and we have to remember and be very real, these are just beds for people. That's it, and a roof over their head. They're not homes, you know. So we're fighting about the Irish rights to houses and the housing crisis. These people are being put into horrible, absolutely nasty living conditions. Direct provision didn't work. It was set up a temporary solution that's now there 22 years later. Also, when the GP is overcrowded, when you can't get an appointment, you're blaming the foreigners instead of blaming the government. Do you know what I mean? And it's wild suiting them. And we have to look at that as people, and how do we tackle the government instead of, as I said, people. But Thomas Pringle, Deputy Pringle, I think has a. You had your hand up.
Well, there's a lady here indicated, and then yourself, Thomas, the lady with the dark hair.
Thank you all very much. I just wanted to say a couple of things. Like, I've been involved in activism myself for a while, and I'm not affected by racism. I'm very middle class, white Irish, but my husband is Senegalese, my kids are mixed race, and I would definitely identify as libertarian socialist. But I think what we need to talk about very clearly is a few things. Like, I think the middle class is something we have to look at. Like, we know that the middle class racism is the worst in most ways. The middle class who are comfortable enough, not comfortable but struggling and so on, but you know, we don't see any. I teach in university, and I've seen my colleagues exhibit racist behaviour. I have attempted to educate them. These are very well educated people. It's very under the radar stuff, but it has involved things like calling security on students of colour. I have done all of the right things, you know, chatted, sent links, emails, all of that. And I occurred again, and I just call them straight out on it. And I realise that they are fundamentally racist. They will never acknowledge their own racism. But the only thing is to just make it not acceptable, because there's no point with the softly. I really don't believe that anymore. I think we can all see what's happening in Ireland and what's happening everywhere. Right? You know, climate change is going to make it way worse. We're going to have everyone struggling. You know, cost of living. There's going to be more refugees. The far right is an open door, because we live in a capitalist state where we have essentially a conservative Tory government that doesn't give a crap about refugees at all, doesn't give a crap about most people. And honestly, I accept your point, Helena, about, you know, our local TDs, but they don't give a crap. No. They might be nice fellas down on the football pitch. They're nice to you because they know you, they're Irish. You know. But I have this direct experience. They don't give a shit about migrant communities at all, because they don't vote, they're not interested in them, and all the rest of it. So, like, I'm not adding anything more, except I think we need to be extremely militant, and we need a national unity campaign. Like, repeal in some ways was very, very successful. We talked about gay marriages, other very successful campaigns. A failure in repeal was the complete lack of, it was a middle class victory in the end, right? But we all hoped that there would be, like, it was a great example of a grassroots that forced the government, not because the government cared about women's rights or anything else. So I just think that we need a unity, we need militancy. And I mean, I've done a lot of trainings, I've done difficult conversations. Training was talking about racism and the like, but education is needed, but I think we have to be unapologetic and very much with the middle class as well. As much as, you know, the working class communities are the ones that have this volunteers. Where are they coming from? They're doing this work, you know, and all the rest of it. But I just think, I think any person of any marginalised background will tell you that middle class racism is the most insidious and hardest to fight, and it's something we have to name. And the government is delighted with all of that, and most people don't give a shit. So we have to call everything out. You know, that's it.
Just on that. First of all, I'm unapologetically militant.
Yes.
So that is, you know.
Yeah.
But I'm coming from a working class background. The town I live in, the town I grew up in, I love it. It's a brilliant town. We are a unemployment black spot. We actually have been identified this year as a food poverty black spot. I'm on a food poverty network with Sláinte Care and and we're discussing how we're going to like encourage people to eat healthy while being broke and not being able to afford the basics, right? So I'm not coming from a middle class anything. Secondly, middle class people are just working class people who want to think that they're better than the working class. That's my view. Middle class is it's a constructed class to buffer zone between the working class, which is everyone, and the ruling class. Sorry if you like being middle class, and I'm not getting at you. I'm literally, this is what I'm saying. I'm college educated. I at one stage owned my own house, like you know what I mean. Still not working, still not middle class, because it's a made up class. You know, if you have to work week in week out to maintain your living, then you're working class. So that's that. But I get what you're saying, the middle class.
It's an identity.
It's an identity, and they build their identity around that I'm better than.
Yes.
That's supremacy, love, and that's what you smash. You don't take a softly approach with that. That's the one you smash. But little old Breda down at the end of the road, who has her pension to kind of pay and look after her grandchild, who read in Take a Break that the brown skinned man with the beard is in ISIS. She's not coming from a supremacy point of view, she's cacking herself. And you can't go in with a hammer to deal with her. So you have to recognise the difference and how it's structured differently. And you can't deal with the middle class racist the same way as you deal with the lady who's on a state pension who can't afford. She's afraid. You know, she's afraid she's going to have to say goodbye to her kids because they can't afford a house here. The middle class are just afraid that someone else might change their existence. They think they're better than. They'd act like that to Eileen, to myself, to Joe, because they don't like us no more than they like black people, brown people, or anyone else.
They don't like the real working class either.
I think it's important to discuss these categories because with the housing crisis, we are going to have so-called middle class people exposed to a lot of bad housing conditions that people are, because if you see because in the common sense people define working class as low income people in a very narrow sense, but if you think now this moment that we are people from, for example, tech companies are not able to get a mortgage because their work is unstable. So you see that are you fucking middle class? So go and get a house. No, I can't because I still need to I don't have capital. So we are going to have to work towards all these terminologies to build a strong movement. But the racism from the middle class is is the worst. Because in working class people, we get to the point we discuss, we are able to have this humanitarian, this in the human level, people are struggling, we can have this kind of conversation. Of course some people are too pissed, but and we can't, but in a sense you can get through this, but middle class people is just passive aggressive, so we cannot even start a discussion because they are
even in the Shannon, if Sharon gets up and speaks, she's doing her job, but when I get up and speak, I'm at it again. Do you know that kind of way? So that's where but that's where her being a white privileged woman who her partner happens to be a migrant, by the way, so obviously she's not racist, but I'm just saying that is everyday occurrence. But again, I think we should, if we can as a society, shift from blaming, you know what I mean, and trying to look at the root, and there is root problems around racism and discrimination, there is root causes, and obviously we have to look at that as a society as well. And I don't think any of us have the answers this evening, but I do think educators like you in universities that's able to stand up and not apologise as a white woman, and we need more of that. We need people who are able to stand up, and I know myself from last week experienced racism that no other member of Parliament would have to experience, and the amount of backlash that got, you know what I mean? So even for talking out about racism and discrimination, that you can be a target or seen as vulnerable, but of course we have to keep doing it without saying I'm sorry, because people from minority groups, people who do go through racism and discrimination are not looking for special treatment. Basically what people want is basic human rights and equality. So yeah.
Thomas up there, and then Shane, and maybe one more after that.
Thanks. I was just thinking just about what people were saying about organising for about drag prevention bases where they're open and stuff like that. I mean, I don't think we can't rely on the government to give us any information because they're not going to. And basically their attitude is we're going to have a row, so we may as well have it once rather than have it 3 days. Because they'll have it when they say we're thinking about doing drag prevention to be a right end. Then they'll say we've identified the site to be a right end, and then people will be willing to be a right end. So they decide that they just have a one row, get the people in and show it, get it out, and they can walk away from it. So I don't think we can rely on any help from the government in relation to that, and partly as well too, because even though the drag prevention system was moved over to the Green Party, it's still the Department of Justice that's doing it, and they are appalling.
Yes.
And they just view everybody to come here as coming to rape the country, and that's it. So I think what we can do maybe as CDs not there as well is facilitate people by getting information out. And if groups would use the TDs, get as much information to them. The information is generic for every site. Like there's sites in Donegal where the same problems with the ambulances coming and stuff like that because the asylum seekers were sent to Donegal without having passports, without having medical cards, without having anything at all, and they just left there, and that's what happens. So I think use the TDs as generic information. You have that information in a way that it sounds as if it's official, and it sounds as if it sounds good. And you can counter the right-wing arguments at that time, because the people who move in is going to be the same people all over the country anyway. So and you don't need the specifics in terms of who they are and that they're. But don't expect anything from the government, because the government is not going to give anything and nothing's going to come from them. And I'd just like to say as well too, you were just saying in relation to the local TDs and that there. But the local TDs, everybody knows them, and this is a big problem with business and politics in Ireland, that they may be their local TD, they're Fine Gael, they stand for Fine Gael policies when they go to Dublin, and that's the reality. And you have to connect people to the policies all the time and point that out to people, and that's what has to be done. That's the only way. Thanks.
Yeah, so just on the discussion around class and racism and actually Fine Gael, Josepha Madigan would never publicly, I don't think, use the K word, but she's built her political career on opposition to traveller halting sites and group housing schemes for travellers in her constituency. So I think it's very clear. I think it's to your point down there about middle class people or upper middle class people not uttering racism, but actually being far more dangerous racists. And it sort of brings me to the point that Joe touched on that I really want to hear more about, was that Joe, you talked about this is a three-way fight between a progressive working class movement, fascism and the ruling class. And could you expand on that and tell us a bit about the importance of that?
Yeah, I'm
thinking.
No, I was thinking. Sorry. I know what I meant. Just while I'm thinking, I can talk as well, and I think you're completely right about middle class racism, because, as we know, and some of the protesters have said that they've been entirely right. In other areas, they can take injunctions and take legal actions to stop them going in. They don't have to take to the street. So that disguises the fact. I'll come back to you. I had something else I want to say to you in a second. But and when you talk about the hypocrisy of Fine Gael, I'll never forget. I can't think of her name now. The MEP standing up in support of the Black Lives Matter movement a couple of months after she voted to remove the Naval Rescue Service. So she was voting to allow black people to die in the water, but she was standing up on the Black Lives Matter thing. So you can never underestimate the hypocrisy. What I mean by a three-way fight is it's not as simple, and I wish it was, because it would be much simpler. If the issue was that there's racists coming in, bringing racist ideas into our community and affecting our community, so how do we challenge them? That's great. Oh, it's not great, but that's something you could try and do. It'd be straightforward. But you're undermined at every step of the way by government policy. And it's exactly what happened to us, as I said when I was talking. I mightn't have articulated that well. When they were putting people into the building in East Wall, there was no information gone. So those of us who were trying to calm the situation down were doing so on the basis of basically in an abstract with no information to argue with. And then the next day the government do exactly what everybody who was arguing against the building said they were going to do. So I also said it when I was talking that, I'm getting a bit tired now, the long day work as well, that we were alienated from the process. And anybody that was trying to have a sensible argument around this or a sensible discussion on it was alienated because the government took us out of the picture in the discussion because we had no information to argue with, and the people who were saying they're going to do this, they're going to do that, were entirely right. So that's what I mean by it's a three-way fight. It's not as simple as sensible people in the community, progressives in the community, trying to argue a position against racists who are arguing. You're also going to be undermined by government policy. So unless you tie it in, any discussion to try and argue with the people who are on the protest, unless you tie it in with an anti-government position, then you're basically looking like apologists for government policy. And that's something we said from the beginning, and it did hamper us at the beginning, because one woman who would have been very good in the community, I've worked with her for years, I said to her about, we're going to have to do something, this is going to be hectic. She says, I feel really conflicted because I've campaigned against direct provision for years, so now I'm going to campaign to have one in my own area. And for that reason, she felt conflicted. Now, she needed to step up, and she did eventually. So does that explain what I meant by a three-way fight? It's not as simple as anti-racist and racist. There's also a government policy that's feeding into that. And is that okay, Shane? Does that answer what I meant?
It's really useful. I'm going to keep thinking about it. I might come back to it.
It's been really difficult because, I've been active there for decades. There's other people who've been active. We know everybody knows us. We would have been some of the go-to people for issues in the community. Everyone would say, we'll talk to Joe and we'll get Joe to do this. And, even though I said I'm never going to be involved with the planning team, the last major planning team, I ran it all because I was dragged into it because people wanted me. With this one, I kind of had no position for a while. We were just left. We couldn't step out and have a counter-protest, physically confront people, because it would have been counterproductive. We couldn't come in and say, right, this is how we're going to solve it, because we'd no information and we'd no allies. We had to stand back and let the protest move ahead of it, and then slowly work our way in with the people. So I don't know whether that's very clear. I am getting tired. Sorry. The other thing, when you're talking about have the government done anything to help, and I know Thomas came in there on it as well. I think it is essential, though, I know the point Thomas is making, it is essential that we hammer home to the government all the time that this has been done wrong, this is your fault. We can't just say they're never going to do it and leave them. It has to be hammered home. You are creating this. And don't forget, the Green Party in their election manifesto pledged to close down direct provision, and they're actually lording over a much worse version of it. But also on that, it's simply a numbers game for them, and that really struck me when somebody said to me, about the one in East Wall. I was saying, I don't know how they're going to react. And he says, what do you this was recently. He says, what do you expect them to do? They've won. They wanted to put people in there. They didn't want to engage with the community. The people are in there. They haven't engaged with the community, and they don't stay there. So they've won. They don't care that our community's torn apart. They don't care that they've alienated people in the community. Lifelong friends have fallen out over this. They don't care that those people are living in shit conditions. They don't care that there's tension between locals and the people in the building. It's a numbers game. They wanted to put a certain amount of people in, and they've done it. And it's completely callous. And even some of the people that were on the protest have said, I'd be worried about that building. I don't think that's suitable. They've more compassion for the people in the building than I think some of the politicians have. It's purely and simply a numbers game for them. And I think that's a terrible way to treat people. And the other thing that wasn't touched on, and I think Dublin Community Against Racism have done a really good job highlighting this, is all the ways the government are feeding into the racism and facilitating for it. They have, since the Ukraine war broke out, they have created a two-tier refugee system. Yes. And that's really important because people in our area were saying, I wouldn't mind if they were Ukrainians, or we take Ukrainians, we don't want them. And that's because the government decided We won't go into the politics of why they decided.
I brought that up in the Shannons around the two-tier refugee system that they created, and I had Garrett Ahern attacking me, saying to me, actually Ukrainians are not refugees. You know, and I did talk obviously with the Refugee Council and with ENAR as well to try and tackle it in there, but unfortunately that's where it is. And when you talk about the three-way collision or whatever you want to call it, we have a three-way government as well, you know, where we have Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil and the Greens, where, as Thomas said rightly, the Department of Justice, which is Fine Gael led, should be making sure people have proper homes and dignity of life as well, you know, where they're pushing everything over to the Greens. I'm far from a Green, but they're pushing everything over for the Greens, so at the next elections they can say, actually vote Fine Gael, vote Fianna Fáil, it wasn't us, it was the Greens, and that's them thinking ahead as well.
It is important to say that the Greens have fed into this, like if you look at some of the for all groups, and I'm not going to knock people who genuinely want to help refugees, to have Fine Gael people standing on protest saying refugees welcome here while their ministers are responsible for hiding tension, it's just like, it's an insult to everybody. But I just think they have, with the two-tier system, they have, as you just said, they have in some ways legitimised racism. They've given people a way of saying, I don't want them, but dressing her up as something else, like, oh, I'm not racist because I'd happily accept Ukrainians. So they have created, they have bred a sinister, like a form of racism as well.
Yeah.
So would you not just think that within society, I'm of an age, I'm in my late 50s now, but when I was reared in the north of Ireland, when I came down here originally, I just couldn't get over the amount of racism towards the travelling community. Because where I came from, in a country area in County Down, that was never there. They were just part of us. Do you know what I mean? It just wasn't there. And the first thing I saw when it came to the 26th state was the serious, from the working class as well as the middle class. And I actually believe that racism has always been here because of we're such an insular society. And where it's really ingrained is any office that let's call it plus 40. None of my kids, none of their friends, they're all extremely, from what I can, from the wide circle, I have a big family, but from that wide circle of those young people, let's call them all over 25, I don't see any of them, I'm glad to say, and then in any form or shape, or their sexuality or whatever, as this senator would say, they're open to everyone. The racism is in the older people, especially from my generation. It's just ingrained among the working class and among the middle class.
I would have thinking that, until COVID and my kids were doing homeschool on the computers. So one of them was in TY and it was stunning how racist some of the kids were in the classes. And these were 16, 17-year-olds. There was arguments every day to the point where she was closing computers and that in social care, you know, so CSP and all these classes. So like twice a week we get our battle gear on ready for these classes because some of the kids, Mairead, my youngest is nodding there, she's in 3rd year, and the kids in her class, some of them are vile. And I will agree that that does come from a class thing, but on the traveller issue, and Eileen's probably going to jump in here, probably the only systematic racism in Ireland is against the travelling community, where systems are built into our government, our schooling system, our education, our social welfare system. They're built against the travelling community. Mm-hmm. It doesn't allow for travellers.
I'm actually writing a book at the moment around some of the life experience, and just recently I was thinking back to the life experience where I remember actually going up to the top of the site to get a vaccination because we wasn't allowed to go and see the doctor for everybody. We had to see the traveller doctor, the traveller nurse. And actually this is like very real and in my time, which is absolutely, you know, you think happened so many years ago. And even down to the fact that like I remember going with my mother to Castle Street, which is Thomas Street, is a social welfare office, and every traveller in the whole country, and let them be living in Longford to Dublin, all had to go to Castle Street for social welfare. Like when you think about that level of discrimination where travellers were put into, and it has changed obviously, but again the 1963 itinerant report has really shaped how the government deals with the traveller community. And I will say one thing that I find, well, I hope it's a safe space, that the far right will jump in that too, because like they're trying to recruit members of the traveller community into their movement. You know, and I don't think any racism or discrimination should be acceptable, but I think the traveller one, like going to the pub, is more spreadable. It's more look at the travellers than any other form of racism. And I think again it hurts in similar ways, you know what I mean, because we all have feelings and everything else that goes with that. But you know, I do think there's and it's exhausting dealing with racism on a daily basis, and trying to tackle it as much as you can is absolutely, because you're constantly defining who you are. And I see a lot of refugees doing it at the moment, where, you know, I'm a good person, I have a degree in AB, like really trying to show society that you're good enough to exist, you're good enough to be here. And at the moment I'm looking at, with the community, of getting a state apology, further legislation that they put in place for our community, and that even that travellers put into their own schools up until very recently as well, you know. So again, like the government just want to keep the others down, but it's really like I'd like to end on a high. How do we build each other up? And like here, these kind of conversations, you're preaching to the choir, you're preaching to the people who are part of the change, who want to be the change within society. But how do we spread that to our local communities? And yeah.
As well, this perception is going to vary according to who is the person involved in it. Because if we talk about with any Brazilian person, they are like every Brazilian person, the delivery driver is totally afraid of the teenagers, because we are like abused on the streets. So it all depends on who you are. So you are going to have a different perception of the level, or who are the agent of who is being racist in society. So it's like who is from minority communities are going to know that's like everyone is in this, but particularly the teenagers and from middle class to working class. We have been abused on the streets. Like when you arrive in Ireland, they say be careful, because if you are in Summerhill, they're going to throw you eggs and all kind of things. So there's a general knowledge of Brazilian and Latin America people who came studying English in Ireland. Like they throw shit in us all the time. And in a middle class perspective, when I don't know if I should say, but like correcting homework from students as well, you can see that even if they're from middle class, they are pretty much racist. Or sometimes I'm in doubt if it's just like sometimes a genuine concern, sometimes it's reproducing common sense, and you can navigate. Sometimes it's just like common sense and racism.
Okay, I'm getting indications from our organiser up there that we're getting near the end, so I'd like to thank everybody for speaking. Joe, Elena, Juliana and Eileen. Give them a round of applause. There's been a couple of mentions during the course of the meeting, and Helena was here representing Dublin Communities Against Racism. Just to let people know that the leaflet that was mentioned, which we're encouraging people to distribute in their areas or in their shops or community centres, door to door, wherever you like, there's still loads of them around, and you can get them from Aaron in the shop. And just one other thing that's coming up the weekend, and because somebody from Donegal came all the way down to support us, there's a lot of us here are interested in the history of anti-racism and anti-fascism as well. And next Saturday in Meggery in Donegal, which is out beyond Dunglow on the beautiful sea coast, there's an unveiling of a monument to the volunteers from Donegal who were fought and were killed in the Spanish Civil War, 86 years ago now. And this is a memorial to 10 men and Pat O'Donnell, who was from that area. So there's a post up there on the way out if people want to have a look. And I know it's a bit of a trek to Donegal, but it'll definitely be worth it. I know it's a commute for you, so most people it's a long way. So again, thanks to everybody for coming along. I think this way we could probably spend another 2 hours here talking, because it was that kind of a meeting that was really positive. So thank you all again.
Great.